Alright, hopefully my recording is working and I actually am being recorded, but welcome back once again to finally getting these postings back up for our World Civilizations 1 class on a relatively normal schedule. So, now that I'm going to be finally caught up with our recordings after this, we should be able to proceed normally from here on out. So again, thank you for your patience, and I do once again apologize for my weird technology issues. My recording software has not been kind to me lately. But in the meantime, as I mentioned a little bit previous, or as you probably saw in the syllabus, this week we're going to be continuing to compare the Christian and Islamic worlds around the turn of the millennium. This time we'll be looking a little bit more about how the Islamic world continued to fragment as various other caliphs and governments started to spring up. And then on our next video, we'll look a little bit more at the Christian world and how Christianity started to spread across Europe and influence Europe. So again, this time specifically, we're going to look at the fragmentation of Islam. As always, I like to start things off with our key terms. We're going to discuss the invention of the magnetic needle compass and the role that played in the Islamic world and really the world as a whole. We'll look again at the jizya tax. We'll look at the group of people called the Seljuk migrants. We'll look at a pretty fascinating dance actually called the dervishes. And we'll look at a branch of Islam called Sufism. Now, as always, I do, of course, want to make sure you are aware of important upcoming dates. Your fourth content quiz is, of course, due this Saturday at 5 p.m. And again, as I said in an email recently, this is Saturday. I'm giving you an extra day to get caught up on things because our midterm was last week. Excuse me. Your second writing assignment will be coming up next Friday at 5 p.m. And your fifth content quiz will be coming up the following Friday, again, of course, at 5 p.m. Now, I think we should have a pretty good understanding of how all these assignments work and where they'll be located at this point. But, of course, if there's any questions, please don't hesitate to run them by me. You should, of course, all have my email information, obviously, at this point, and feel free to stop in during office hours at any time. But until then, we'll go ahead and jump into really a big major topic for the rest of the semester, essentially. What I'd like you to sort of consider throughout the rest of the semester, really, but especially for these two lessons, is religious tolerance. So essentially, a few questions I'd like you to keep in mind. What exactly should religious tolerance look like? I've talked quite a bit about the religious tolerance, religious diversity, and all that fun stuff in this class, but I feel like we've never really exactly defined what religious tolerance is. So what I want you to do is maybe research just a little bit or think for yourself, what exactly should religious tolerance be, and maybe keep that in mind to sort of compare with the civilizations we talk about for the rest of the semester. For example, compared to our society, is America a religiously tolerant country? If you've ever watched the news for more than 5 seconds in your entire life, you know that's probably still a pretty hotly debated issue today. So keep that in mind, definitely. Also, is religious tolerance a good thing? That may seem like a pretty obvious answer because I've sort of, I think, even tried to be objective, praised the importance of religious tolerance in this class. But think about it from multiple perspectives, for example. We've talked a little bit about why it can be good from a citizen or a person's perspective, but how is the government going to treat religious tolerance? Is it a good thing for them? Then, what I'd like you to do, especially this week, as we again compare the Christian and Muslim worlds, has Islam been a religiously tolerant religion in the time we've discussed? And has Christianity been a tolerant religion? And are we right about our interpretations of this, perhaps even more importantly? Keep that in mind as we continue, especially. But anyway, one thing you need to be aware of in the big picture, or in the grand scheme of things, however you want to say it, for the rest of the semester is the global spheres of influence that are really going to take up most of our time for the rest of the semester. By about 1000 CE, most historians argue that the world was now divided into 4 major zones of influence. So you have the Islamic world, which takes up a good portion of North Africa and, of course, the modern-day Middle East. You have India over in this section over here. I'm just now realizing this map is actually kind of terrible, but hopefully you all know a little bit about world geography. Then, of course, China, which takes up, the civilization of China takes up most of East Asia at this point. And, of course, you have Europe, which, as we'll talk a little bit more about in the next lesson, is becoming more and more united under the flag of Christianity. So, based on what we've discussed, Why do you think America and most of Africa is not included on this list? So you can see here, Africa is sort of ignored from this. The Americas are mostly ignored from this as well. Why are they not considered to be on this global sphere of influence? Our first awkward pause of the day. Maybe to help us answer that, by the way, what separates these four spheres of influence from the rest of the world? What do they all have in common that we've discussed? Okay, that should probably help jog your memory a little bit if you've been paying attention. These four areas of the world have universalizing religions that are uniting people in one common identity. As we talked about, especially with India and China at this point, for example, there's large international trade routes that connect these people together. And in some form or another, you typically have some kind of large territorial state, once again, uniting multiple people into one common identity. While it is an oversimplification to say that Africa and the Americas were primitive, because that's sort of a stereotype we like to throw out there to justify colonization, it is true that they did not they did not have quite the international influence these four major spheres of the world had. No real international trade routes, and politically, for the most part, they were kind of like the Vedic peoples we've mentioned a few times who are living in India, where they did, of course, have governments and they had different sorts of political organizations, but there was no one clear overarching government for the most part that controlled a large region of the area. So it was more like isolate or individual governments set up that had some sort of occasionally common culture and common languages. So again, it is an oversimplification to say they're primitive, but the reason we don't consider them these great zones of influence is they didn't really have any international influence. They weren't really influencing anybody or trading with anybody except themselves. So, keep that in mind. That's a big reason we're going to be mainly focusing on these four regions for the rest of the class. In the meantime, part of what helped make these four zones of influence so influential is the increase of sailing technology around again the turn of the millennium. Now, why would sailing technology be so important in helping the world connect, do you think? As I again stroke my beard like a James Bond villain. All right, very good. It essentially just comes back down again to that map I've shown you. Remember, we talked a little bit already about the Silk Road by the sea and the importance of sea trade in helping traders reach various parts of the world. You can't really do that without seafaring technology. One of the more important inventions during this time period was the magnetic needle compass, which was actually originally developed by the Chinese by at least the 12th century. Now, what exactly is this and why would that be so useful? I'll figure out what to do during these pauses eventually. But yeah, just to put it very simply, for those of you who maybe aren't Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or anything like that, a compass, of course, just uses a magnetic pulse to be able to point to the direction north, allowing for much better long distance travel over water, in this case, especially. This is especially important, as you might imagine, to enable some of this long distance sea trade, because when you're out in the open ocean, you have no bearings in order to know which way you're going. Whereas if you just sail along the coast, you can just use the land to guide your way. Not really possible when you're sailing on the open ocean. So this, of course, allowed the increase in international trade. Also, the cargo capacity of ships increased during this time. For example, you had junks, which were cargo ships that could carry about 200 to 500 tons, and you had ships called cogs, which had now been built with flat bottoms, which meant they weren't swayed as much by the tide and waves and the shifting of the ocean, which made them easier to load and unload, which made trade more efficient. So again, trade was essentially becoming more sophisticated during this time, and ships could more easily travel in places they'd never been to before. Now, to get more specifically into what Islam was going through, which is why you're here. Now, interestingly, historians are actually pretty divided, and some consider Islam to be a very tolerant religion during this time period, which is probably not what many of us living in this day and age in this part of the world would tend to expect. Now, one of the reasons historians claim this is, as we talked about a little bit last week, even when they had some of their empires established, such as the Umayyads and the Abbasi, Arabic Muslims were typically in the minority. They were typically ruling over ethnic groups and religious groups that were larger than themselves. Why would that maybe make them a more tolerant religion? Well, good job, viewers at home who like to imagine are answering me. It is, of course, because you can't really impose your will very easily when you're heavily outnumbered. If your government has, if your population has a majority that supports you, it would be much easier for you to start passing more Islamic-focused laws and preferential treatment to Muslim peoples. However, it would be like, for example, if a president tried to come in now and outlaw Christianity in America. Probably not going to go very well because the vast majority of Americans, maybe not the vast majority, but at least still a majority, still identify as Christians. That would not go over very well. These Islamic empires faced very similar issues. So, for example, Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian communities were noted to exist in both of these empires, and they were even free to pick their own leaders and handle their own disputes. So, we talked a little bit before about the balance of power in empires. So, to compare a little bit, is this system a good thing? Is it going to be helpful for the empire? Yeah, for those of you who are hopefully making comparisons to things like the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire, it's again sort of that balance between central authority and having districts and provinces that we've talked about earlier. On the one hand, it might encourage loyalty because your culture isn't being erased and you're being given freedom. But on the other hand, historians have noted that it probably helped lead to the fragmentation of these Islamic empires because these communities were given the freedom to essentially run themselves and eventually would not feel the need to be a part of this larger empire anymore. Finally, these communities were also required still to pay something called the jizya tax. This, of course, again was a tax for infidels, and they were ultimately still required to submit to the Muslim authorities. So, essentially, is this a real freedom of religion system? Alright, very good. Once again, imaginary class. This is again a hotly debated issue. Because again, on the one hand, some people like to focus on the idea that they were allowed to pick their own leaders and could handle their own disputes to a certain extent. But many people also see the jizya tax, and this will come up again later in other Islamic empires and Islamic governments, as sort of an economic coercion into getting a conversion. So you're not officially forcing people legally to convert to Islam, but some impoverished communities might just convert in order to avoid this tax. Which I do want to point out, this is pointed out by some of my other classes actually. This isn't necessarily just a bad reflection on the Islamic governments and the Islamic religion. It also could lead to false conversions to people who don't fully embrace Islam. So it could hurt the religion as well because you're getting converts who only join just to save a few bucks, essentially. So again, it could arguably have a negative effect on both sides. So again, Islam was capable of showing tolerance, but like many other religious governments we've discussed, there did appear to be a limit to this tolerance. Now, one of the other reasons the Islamic empires as a whole had trouble staying united, besides the community issues we already discussed, is once again the climate. During this time period that many historians call the Dark Ages cool period, freezing temperatures and a lack of rainfall started to spread and affect the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, and Central Asia. Low water levels in particular struck the Nile River Valley, which, as you might imagine, is a serious problem for the region. We talked about that a little bit earlier in the semester. Why would Africa have such a problem if the Nile River starts going dry? Very good, once again, imaginary class. Remember the Nile River's importance in relation to the rest of Africa. As you can see here at this little tiny little trade route that you can maybe barely see on my screen right now, the Nile River is really the only significant river in most of Africa and was the only place that you could really have effective irrigation and effective water trade. So essentially, if the Nile River starts to go dry, there's no other game in town, so a huge portion of the region is going to suffer as a result. It actually eventually got to the point where the summer floods in Egypt were reduced by about a quarter, so a huge loss in water flow coming into the region. Because of this, Turkish nomads eventually did come into the region by about the 8th century, And very similar to the chariot nomads we discussed earlier, they quickly started invading and trying to make this new place a bit more like a home for them, which, as you might imagine, does lead to a lot of changes. These migrants in particular, focusing mainly on the Seljuk warriors of the 11th century, did help cause a lot of political fragmentation in the Muslim states. Now, one of the biggest changes in this was to sort of change the balance of power between the Sunni and Shiite division of Islam we mentioned last time. For example, from about 950 to 1050 CE, most Muslim power bases were Shiite. So most of the major powerful Muslim empires were Shiite or Shia. For example, the Fatimid Empire, which existed around Egypt and northern Africa, which you can see a little bit of here. This empire was mostly a Shiite empire as well. The Abbasid Empire, we mentioned a little bit last week, was still based in Baghdad at this point, and was ruled by a Shiite family, the Buyids. So again, very much in his Shiite power base. One of the ways they accomplished this was they established religious universities in their capitals that primarily or exclusively taught Shiite Islam. Why would they do this? It's essentially, you could argue, indoctrination. Very good viewers watching at home. If you're able to make sure that your people are being educated in your form of Islam, that essentially is going to help ensure that people are going to follow the branch of Islam that you want them to, and therefore stay loyal to your government. As you might imagine, this wasn't always a very good place for Sunni Muslims to live, and so as a result of this, by about 1050, Sunni Muslims started to revolt and overthrow some of these Shiite power bases. For example, by 1055, these Seljuk Turk migrants again had taken over Baghdad and led to the rapid shrinking of the Abbasid Empire. But throughout the 1150s, the Fatimids submitted to a Sunni regime in Egypt, which again led to a fall of one of the major Shiite power bases. So essentially, when these various migrants came in, they started to overthrow some of the old Shiite power bases. Now, to give you an idea of what this was like for everyone, this again did lead to a new balance of power. For example, the Seljuk Turks went throughout their new territory and destroyed some Shiite universities, public libraries, and looted some antiquities. The Muslim police were now forced to defer to the Turks over their old religious leaders. In the former Fatimid territory, Arabic was still able to remain the primary language of the empire, but non-Arab military men who had migrated into the region now held the majority of the political power. So, is this a positive change in the Arabic world? Is it a good thing this switch in the balance of power happened? Alright, as you can probably guess, this one does largely really depend upon your perspective, but I think I would argue from a more academic perspective that it's essentially just the putting the shoe on the other foot. There's no real increase in cooperation, tolerance, or anything like that. It's just now the Sunni Muslims are essentially doing to the Shiite Muslims what happened to them. So again, this is a very common issue, and we'll talk about it in how it occurred in Christianity, for example, where the religious switch in the balance of power doesn't necessarily lead to an improvement. It just leads to further conflict. Now, to end things on a bit more of a positive and less conflict-based note, we're going to end things looking at Sufism. As I'll talk about in just a second, Sufism is considered to be a more mystic branch of Islam that actually has some support in both Shiite and Sunni Islam. What I'd like you to do to introduce you to these guys, how I'd like to introduce you to these guys, is have you see an example of their dervish or whirling dance. You'll see this YouTube link right here that you should be able to follow. Please make sure you go ahead and pause this video and watch that. But, however, before you do pause, I would recommend you ask yourself or consider during the video, is this an activity you would have typically associated with Islam before? And do you think this dance will be popular among traditional Muslims? Now, to give you a bit of a hint, for those of you who are more familiar with Southern Baptist beliefs or Protestant beliefs, which, again, your religious beliefs are none of my business, but I would assume at least a few of you are familiar with it in this part of the world. How would people like that react and other Protestants react to dancing in church? Use that maybe as a point of comparison. So again, go ahead and pause this video and make sure you check that out. Alright, I'm going to assume you've gone ahead and done that now. Let's wrap things up by looking at Sufism. Sufism is again considered to be a more mystical and communal form of Islam. It gets its name from the Arabic word suf, or wool, which many devotees, as you can see in that video for example, still wear to show their penitence, or essentially sorrow for their sins. The primary belief that separates them from other Muslims is that it is possible for them to grow close to Allah and embrace His presence in this life. They don't just have to wait until paradise to have a close relationship with Allah or God. This is often accomplished through asceticism, which, if you remember, is essentially where you give up all your worldly pleasures, fast, and things like that in order to have spiritual enlightenment. Now, how is this maybe similar to Greek Orthodoxy, for example? And based on that, how do you think some traditional Muslims might react to this belief? Very good, those of you who pay attention and or had good notes. If you remember, Greek Orthodoxy was the branch of Christianity that believed that Jesus' main goal was to essentially help us become gods, not just to free us from our sins. That, of course, led to a lot of backlash from other Christians who really emphasized the importance of Jesus saving people from their sins. Sufism had some similar backlash from Muslims who believed they were too mystic and were potentially trying to equate themselves too much with the law and weren't showing enough penitence. Very interesting comparison. Few rituals that separated them from the other Muslims as well. They would gather repeatedly to just say the name of God over and over in rituals that would sometimes last hours. They also frequently gathered to read the Quran and other religious documents in very long reading ceremonies. Finally, Jalal al-Din Rumi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who lived from about 1207 to 1273, eventually did establish the Mevlevi Sufi order and started the dervish dances you just saw in the last video. So, to go ahead and wrap things up, why do you think this movement might help actually make Islam a bit more universal? All right, there are a couple of things you might have noted that would make this seem a bit more universal and appealing. First, again, it was a very communal form of Islam. Sufism focuses very much on having communal relationships and frequent cooperation between members of this religion. That, of course, attracts many people who like to have a more communal religion. Also, many people do like the idea of having maybe a less threatening and less aloof God that they're able to grow close with and have a close relationship with, rather than just waiting until the next life. This, of course, as some of you might be aware, is very similar to many Christian religions and other religions we've discussed. Some can make it much more appealing to people who want to have a closer mystical relationship with their creator than, again, just waiting until paradise. So again, Sufism is another example of how some religions can become more universal by changing a few of their practices and adopting some of another religion's. Again, that's all I have for you this time. Just make sure you go over these final reminders and let me know if you have any questions about the assignments. But again, in the meantime, you are all free to go, of course, or click off of this video. Just let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.